Daily Rambam for Friday, Chav Ches Tishrei, Tavshin Pei Aleph, Perek Chi, the 9th Perek of Hilchos Brachos. So yesterday, in just about half an hour, we went through the whole Brachos HaPeiros. We made a siyum on the whole subject. Okay, so now we're moving on to Hilchos Brachos HaReach. Smell, Besamim. So these halachas in Shulchan Aruch are in Siman Reish Tazayin, which happens to be the exact spot where the Alter Rebbe Shulchan Aruch gets completely cut off until Hilchos Shabbos. However, we actually do have these halachas in Seder Birkas Hanenin and Perek Yud Aleph. Interestingly, in Tav Shalom Tes, Levi Bistrutsky wrote an article in Yagol Torah in Yerushalayim about the Luach Birkas Hanenin versus the Seder Birchos Hanenin. Both were published by the Alter Rebbe, one of the few things in the halacha the Alter Rebbe himself published, unlike the Shulchan Aruch. The Luach was printed separately as its own work, maybe to hang up in shul or something. It's like a Luach. And you have the Seder Birchos Hanenin, which is printed in the Seder. It's part of the Alter Rebbe's Seder. You have the Seder Birchos Hanenin. So there are differences. There are a number of differences. So this article was going through all the differences. Interestingly, one of the major differences is that the whole Hilchos Birchos HaReach were added Yesh Me'ayin in the Luach. There's no Hilchos Brachos Hareach, and then Seder Brachos Hanenin we have Brachos Hareach. So we have what the quote from the Alter Rebbe. Let's move on now to the Rambam, who introduces the subject to us here in Halacha Aleph. So the Rambam says, "Kashem she'aseh le'adam le'hanes b'machal b'mashke kreidem bracha." Just as it is prohibited for a person to derive benefit from food or drink without a bracha before he makes a bracha, kach asr loy le'hanais bereach toiv kaidem bracha. So the same would go for enjoying a good smell. Now this is referencing back what it said in Perek Aleph, right in the beginning of Hilchos Brachos, that Rambam said, "B'divrei seifrim, a person has to make a bracha before every food, and then have hana, and if already go over there, v'cheinim hiriach reach toiv." So first you have to make a bracha, and then you enjoy. Now the emphasis here is on reach toiv, a good smell. So there's a difference between eating and smelling. With eating, basically anything that's edible, whether you enjoy the taste or not, but there's a hana in eating. Whereas for smell, it's specifically smelling a good smell, not just the regular any smell you pass through the day. The chaitzad. Oh, before we continue, so the Kesef Mishnah says, where does this idea come from? So it's a Gemara in Brachos that Rav Zutra Bar Tovia said, Amar Rav, that minayin shemavarch nalareach. How do we know this? It says, Kol neshama tahalel ka. What's the neshama? Why is the neshama praising Hashem? The guf praises Hashem for things the guf enjoys. Why is the neshama praising Hashem? Ezu davar shaneshama nanas mimanu. What does the neshama enjoy? And not the guf. Havemer zehareach. So the neshama enjoys the reach. This is a concept that's mentioned in Chassidus about the concept of reich and how special it is, and the connection to etzem haneshama, based on this Chazal and others as well. Before I continue, I just want to parenthetically mention that look at the Sichas Chelek Yudaled Hazinu Beis is an interesting discussion about the gather of Birchos HaTorah. So Birchos HaTorah, what category do Birchos HaTorah fit into? Birchos HaMitzvah, making a bracha on a mitzvah. The Rebbe there quotes the Alter Rebbe in Shulchan Aruch, where it says to be very careful with Birchos HaTorah, and the person should see to it that it should be chashuv that the Hashem's special kli chamdasei shel Kadosh Baruch Hu, Hashem's plaything, is so special to him that he makes a bracha on it. B'simcha yaiser me'al kol hanoah sheba'olam. You should make a bracha with greater simcha than any other pleasure in the world. So the Rebbe points out that the general thrust of the Alter Rebbe's words comes from the Ran, but that sentence, Yaiser me'al kol hanoah sheba'olam, where does that sentence come from? It's more than, if you look in the Levush is between the Ran and the Alter Rebbe, you have the Levush. The Levush wrote that you should make a bracha b'simcha to show that you're nena mimenu k'moishe mevarech al kol hanoah. So it sounds like according to the Levush, you're making the bracha b'simcha because you are enjoying the Torah. The Alter Rebbe changed it and said that you have a greater simcha greater than the simcha you have from any hana in the world. Levush said you're showing that it's chashiv and you're enjoying it like every other hana. So the Rebbe says yesh leimar that according to the Levush, Birchos HaTorah is mamish Birchos Hanenin. You're making a bracha that you're learning Torah and you enjoy it, you understand it, you enjoy it. According to the Alter Rebbe, no, it's not. The Alter Rebbe was deliberately changed the wording. That's not that you're enjoying the words. It's just a simcha regarding the special connection of the Yidden, Hashem, Torah. And the Rebbe says there's a whole huge footnote there. It fills almost the entire page. The Rebbe says, if you're going to say that it is Brachos Hanen, then the Levush said, so then that doesn't stem with the Rambam. The Rambam says that we don't make a bracha on hana, on enjoyment that doesn't enter the body. So, for example, you take a cold shower and it's a great relief. It's very enjoyable. You won't make a bracha on it because it didn't enter your body. It says like beguf v'haguf nena mehem, like achila, shtia. Those are Birchas HaShavach or other things like things like Teva Meitiv, Dayan Emes. Those are not Birchas Hanen. So they have different. If it's not Birchas Hanen, it has a different framework, has a different category. But don't Birchas Hanen specifically. So he says you have to enjoy. It has to enter your body like achila, shtia, v'reach nami. So smell is also something that's a davar nichnas leguf v'sayedu, and it gives you some kind of satiation. It's like eating and drinking. Ritba. Shalah, quotes a Shalah, it says the Reach is Neshama Nanisboy, and it's also Nachas Ruach Leguf. So the Shalah thought it was important to emphasize that the Reach does go into the Guf, and that's connecting, line with this Ramban. So that would mean that the Levush is a bit problematic according to that approach. The Reach has to, even though we're saying the Davar Shem Neshama Nanimimenu, and the Lashon of the Gemara, at least in our text, is I think the Leia Guf, but Lamaisa halachically. Yeah, but halachically, according to the definition of the Ramban, cited in the Shalah, so there has to be, even in Reach, you have to say that the guf is, it's entering the guf in some form, that the guf is involved. And then the Rebbe, in a footnote to the footnote, is mitzayin to the Alter Rebbe in Hilchos Yom Kippurim, and the Alter Rebbe writes over there, Levishareach hu davar she'ein haguf nene mimenu klal, ela haneshama bilvad nenes mimenu. So there it sounds like so that's why you could smell on Yom Kippur. So it's only the neshama, not the guf, because if it was the guf, then it would be a problem. So he says no. At least Alter Rebbe said nenes. So that means it enters the guf, and then somehow we're saying that once it enters the guf, the neshama is the one enjoying it, but the guf is obviously in the picture. You have a nose. The nose has its what's the term? Olfactory senses. It goes through that process, and then the hana that is a result is considered a bit more spiritual. It's considered a neshama hana. But of course, the body is involved, and like the Shalah says, mikol makam nachas ruchu gam laguf. Didn't say that it's hana for the guf. It's a nachas ruch for the guf. So you have to somehow work out the definition to involve the guf at the same time that you're saying it's only the neshama. Then it was also mitzvah, interestingly, to the Sefer Siach Hasada of the Kozhik lover, one of the Polish Rabbanim that deals a lot with Chassidish Anhagas, and he has a whole shakla on this. And he's mitzvah to an interesting old Sefer called Sefer Malkiel. That Sefer Malkiel says that only the neshama has anyway, interesting topic. I just wanted to mention that in the context of this Asalei Lehanis B'Reach Tev Kaid Mabrach and that Gemara Shal Neshama Nanas Imanu.
We thought that brings Simcha B'Lev because Hashem Yisharim Simcha Lev.
Right.
So the Lashon is it's Misamer B'Lev. It's not Misamer B'Guf.
Right. Lev in the sense of your mind or your consciousness. Yeah.
According to the Bush that says that the Torah has also in it the meaning of a concept of Birchos Hanen. It's hard to understand it.
Right.
Are we talking about the bracha borei atzei v'samim or borei minei v'samim?
We're going to talk about all those atzei mina. We're about to, in the continuation of this halacha. We're about to get to that. So according to Alter Rebbe, there's no hana involved in. Even in hana, as we just said with reach, there could be spiritual forms of hana that involve the body. So let's say you're learning. Maybe you could argue that it is in a way similar to reach in the sense that your body is involved, you're learning, you're processing the information, and then your mind enjoys it. So maybe that's how you would try to answer the lavush, perhaps. Just that the Rebbe there was clearly leaning against the lavush and towards the Alter Rebbe to say that it is Brachos HaMitzvahs, and the Alter Rebbe changed the wording to sidestep this whole thing. So, continuing in the Rambam, so what bracha do you make on a good smell? So it all depends on what the source of the smell is. So if it's a wood, it's actually a wood, or it's derived from wood, from a tree. So the word is atzei, the woods of that have a good smell. Or if it's a grass, or it's derived from grass. So that's reflected in the bracha. And what if it's not derived at all from a plant, from anything that grows? Kegoin hamar shehu min achaya, which is derived from an animal. Mevarech b'rei minei b'samim. So minei b'samim only enters the picture when it's not a plant-based smell, according to what we're saying here. Now, the myrrh and the Torah, there may have been plants that have been identified. There's a plant, right? And I just want to mention that we mentioned already in Hilchos Avodah Zarah, the last time that myrrh, not that myrrh came up. In Hilchos Avodah Zarah, the Yudoni came up. And the Atzem Oyev Sheshma Yadua, and I mentioned at the time that you have the Rambam that describes, he mentions it here Bekitzer, he mentions it in the Hilchos Klei HaMikdash, the myrrh is a dam that's in the blood, that's a dam atzara b'chaya shebahedu, it's this blood that pools up in this animal in India, Hayadua Lakoil, everyone knows about it, and Shemis Baskin Boy. Of course, so of course we're talking about musk here, and in all the svarim I talk about this halacha going forward, they use the word musk to be clearer. So yeah, we're talking about musk, and the Rambam is saying that's the myrrh that he's talking about, and everyone knows about it. And the Alter Rebbe and Torah and Purim, he's talking about Mordechai, and Mordechai is bittul, and myrrh. So Mordechai has the word myrrh in it, and myrrh, the Alter Rebbe says, is musk, which is the dam chaya yadua, and he says, so that's the idea of this hapcha. You're taking blood and you're turning it into perfume. So that's in line with this idea of Mordechai bittul. And then the Alter Rebbe connects and says, regarding myrrh. Rabbi says you're even allowed to eat it. And some say you're not allowed to eat it because they say that it was only transformed smell-wise, but the substance itself is still aser. And the Rabbi holds that it's completely heter. And the Alter Rebbe says, so that's these halachas that we're discussing right here. And the Alter Rebbe teaches that shita, that machlekes according to Chassidus about zdoinus, nas lekazachias or not. But talking about his hapcha, we said that myrrh, musk, is his hapcha. Here the Alter Rebbe says this chaya yadua is that same chaya oif sheshma yadua by yadaini. So that means it's not just the chaya tmeya; it's mamish klippus atmeis. It's a very desara. And Alpha became somehow we're saying that this baisam, this blood can be transformed into something that's mutter, into something that has a good smell, and it's even mutter. So that's mamish zdoinus nasle kazachias. And then you have maybe the idea that it's not mutter ba'achila. That would be that the tshuva took this dainus and turned it into shkagas, not kazachias. That's how the Alter Rebbe. So that interesting connection there between the Yudoni and musk according to the Alter Rebbe, and ties in actually to the details of these halachas here. If you look inside the Brachos Hananim, so the Alter Rebbe, the way the Alter Rebbe says it is v'chol she'enu le'min eitz le'min eitz v'gein hamor v'hu musk, which comes out of the animal, where the blood pools up and then it dries, and you make the myrrh. Mevarech, you said, and then the Alter Rebbe adds, you're not allowed to put it in a dish. Mishum chashash dam, because maybe it still has a gather of dam. Question is, how much was this the process that transformed it and it's no longer blood? V'yesh martirin, the Alter Rebbe says, say the Brachos Hananim, ubal nefesh yachmer la'atzme b'safek shel Torah. Doesn't sound like he's saying he's mamish taking a side. He's saying it's ubal nefesh should be machmir in a deraisa. So that's halachically, that's the side the Alter Rebbe took. That he didn't want to say that it's eating. Yeah, so that's discussed in these halachas. The Ram didn't get into that, but in the Torah, and then say the Brachos Hananim.
Putting a little bit in the tongue.
Yeah.
If it makes it smell better, why not?
Yeah. All right, so that's where Brei Mina B'Samim comes from. Musk. And if it's a fruit that's edible, citron, apple, a whole different bracha that peiros have a good smell. The truth is though that if you said for everything, you're still yaitza. So the
cousin, if you're holding the apple or the esrog. But if you have, for example, esrog oil.
Oh, okay. Then we're talking about the actual thing. The Kesef Mishnah says Zeh Pashut, that Brei Mina B'Samim includes everything, just like Shahakol includes everything. The language is a very general language. Now, just like Shahakol, you can't go around saying Shahakol for everything because it's B'diavad. So Brei Mina B'Samim should also be B'diavad. So if you look into the Berachos Hanenin, where he talks about, he goes to different brachos. So at one point, there's a certain suffix that comes up in say the Berachos Hanenin. And the Alter Rebbe says there that the suffix, because in this case we don't know if it's an eitz or if it's not. So you should say Beirei Mina B'Samim, which includes all the minim, and then you eitz b'diavad, no matter what it is. And b'chein b'davish, and we see later them himself is going to say in halacha, hey, this idea, whenever you're mesupik, you say Beirei Mina B'Samim, but the way the Alter Rebbe writes it over there is that it's a b'diavad. That's only in a case where you don't know what to say. Now, however, we all know that Matzah Shabbos, you make Havdalah, and people use hadassim, people use cloves, people use cinnamon, people use many different things, and everyone knows by Havdalah you make a Beirei Mina B'Samim. So what happened to all these halachas? So the Alter Rebbe talks about it in Hilchos Havdalah and Siman Reish Tzadik Zayin. The Alter Rebbe says, "V'olam nogu levarech Matzah Shabbos Beirei Mina B'Samim al kol haminim." Why? Because we're not all Baki and Brachos, and who knows which thing you're going to end up with, and what the suffix might be. Who knows what an eitz is and an esav. So make a bracha that you yetzer b'diavad for all the minim. However, the Alter Rebbe says it's best to put a piece of musk into whatever you're making a Beirei Mina B'Samim for Havdalah. So that way you're making a Beirei Mina B'Samim kil chasa. You're actually the one thing that you can actually make a Beirei Mina B'Samim lechatchila on should be preferably mixed in. Where does this come from? Where does Alter Rebbe take this from? So the Alter Rebbe got this from the Magen Avram. Magen Avram in that same Siman Hilchos Havdalah writes that the Taz and Yered Deya and the Shach and the Kudus HaKaseh have a whole pilpul about whether you can use pepper pilpulin for Beirei Mina B'Samim. How does it come up in Yered Deya? So in Yered Deya and Siman Kuf Ches, the Siman is Shalei Lafes Heter V'Isser B'Taner Echad, and then towards the end of the Siman it starts talking about whether you can smell Yayin Esach, and then it says if you have a sack of pilpul or zangvel or ginger that you put in the jugs of Yayin Esach, you're allowed to smell them. Aval B'Samim deHavdalah Aser. That's what it says in Shulchan Aruch and Siman Kuf Ches in Yered Deya. So the Taz says, why is it mutter to smell? Because the wine isn't giving them any koyach. For carrot, they're there to give the wine flavor or smell. And when the person's smelling it, he's not trying to smell wine, he's just trying to smell the actual tavla. But for Havdalah, it's aser because it's mios. And the Taz says, mashma, that's only this pilpul that was in the yayin esach. Kumtais, that otherwise wouldn't be a problem. The loy kamesh matzasi kasav, I saw elsewhere that you shouldn't make Havdalah on pilpul. What's the raya? Because in Gemara Brachos it says pilpeles kol shehu, and then it says mina b'samim kol shehu. So it sounds like pilpul and mina b'samim are not the same thing. Maybe pilpul is a tavlet, a spice. A spice is not a perfume, so maybe according to that opinion, you wouldn't be able to use spices for Havdalah. He says, but look in the Rashi there. Pilpeles doesn't mean pilpul. It means something else over there. So that's what the Taz is talking about over there. So the Magen Avram quotes this Taz, pulls this Taz out from Yered Deya in Hilchos Havdalah, and says that this whole argument, whether pilpul is b'samim or not, does not understand the whole question. If you look in the Beis Yosef in Hilchos Havdalah, he quotes from the Kolboy that says that if you don't have any b'samim and you have some fragrant bread in the oven, you can make a bracha on the bread. That's what Beis Yosef quotes from the Kolboy. So as long as it's hot bread and the smell is wafting through the house. So if you're making Beirei Mina B'Samim on Pascham, so how could there even be an argument about pilpul? It doesn't matter if it's a tavlin or a b'samim, or it doesn't matter what its category is, as long as it has a smell that seems fragrant. Yeah? Is the problem because of Beirei Mina B'Samim and you need to have something that you make the bracha on? What about everything else for making a Beirei Mina B'Samim on? And that's when Magen Avram comes and quotes the Shalah. The Shalah says we're not Baki and Brachos, so we just have Beirei Mina B'Samim on everything. So that automatically means that the Shalah is acknowledging that we can make a Beirei Mina B'Samim on every minute, make the same bracha, and it doesn't matter what it is. So that means we don't have a chash that we're making the wrong bracha. So that could include everything again, right there. So it could be pascham, it could be pilpul, it could be anything. That's where that's the background for the Alter Rebbe saying there that ha'elam nagu levarech. That was how the Magen Avram brought it in that context. Interesting discussion. And the Magen Avram also says mikamakam nidali that you should put a piece of the musk inside. That way That Alter Rebbe quoted that as well. Then he quotes that one of the Rishonim says that when he made the bracha Beri Atzi B'Samim on Matzah Shabbos, you should hold the derech gedilasim. You should hold it. It should be the top should be on top, the bottom should be on bottom. So from that issue in the Kumtois that it says Kshoyim Mevarach Beri Atzi B'Samim. So that means that as recently as then, they still were being medayik and making the correct bracha on the correct item. But by the time the Shalom, Magen Avraham, Alter Rebbe came along. All right. Halacha beis. So we had the mugmar mentioned earlier, also Perek Zion, regarding Brachos Hamazon, that after Brachos Hamazon they bring the mugmar. So the mugmar is I don't know what the correct
incense.
Yeah, it's incense. The idea is that you're taking whatever it is, you're putting it on the fire, and it creates a smoke, a fragrant smoke. That's incense, and that was a practice they had in those days, which is something they did after a meal. So the Rambam is referencing that here and saying that you don't make the bracha until the smoke actually is risen and is spreading or wafting through the house. Then you make the bracha. What bracha do you make on this? You're not smelling the item directly. You're burning it and you're smelling the smoke. What bracha do you make? So it doesn't change it. Whatever ingredient you put in and you smoked, that's the bracha you're going to make. Atzei isvei or minei. Halacha gimel. Shemen shala farsamayim lechayotzevay. Mevarech olav b'rei shemen arev. Okay, what's shemen afarsamayim? So you see it. Well, that's what you would think, because the word afarsamayim and the word persimmon are essentially the same. And in modern Hebrew, they call the persimmon the afarsamayim, I believe. However, how does shemen afarsamayim persimmon? It's not the case. It's quoted throughout Chazal, afarsamayim. It's always a shemen afarsamayim. What is it? So if you look it up, so what the experts who have looked into the case have determined is that it's a plant called the Commiphora gileadensis. It's referring to the word gilad in there. It's the word gilad that comes up in the context of smells, perfume, plants. An easier term to recite would be the Arabian balsam tree. So the word balsam is a bit more familiar. We have people who even have the name. It's a word. It's a thing we know. Okay, so the Arabian balsam tree. It's a particular plant. It grows in the Middle East. It's sometimes confused with the myrrh and with tzadi and begilad. So the word tzadi, a lot of these terms that we find in Tanakh, a lot of them are either interchangeable or confused with each other. So you see a lot of overlap in that kind of way, or they might be related from similar plants. So that's, but it's been determined based on whichever proofs that it's this plant that it's very fragrant. What's very interesting about shemen afarsamayim is that usually when you have descriptions of Chazal of stuff, it's also something that's common to the Middle East. Other people are familiar with it. In the case of shemen afarsamayim, it actually is unique only to Eretz Yisrael. Eretz Yisrael, even in that period of time, Eretz Yisrael was the only location where shemen afarsamayim was produced. And the Romans talk about it, and they spoke about how after they destroyed Eretz Yisrael, they try to rehabilitate the plants to restart production again. It was this balsam. This was there's different types, but this was the unique to Eretz Yisrael, and it only grew in a sort of a cultivated way, only in Eretz Yisrael, in the Emek HaYarden, and in Gedi.
Some portion break down that the oil that was used for the Mashiach of Shol HaMelech.
Right.
Was afarsamayim.
Right. So you have the afarsamayim coming up, yes, in Mashiach, in the context of Mashiach, yes.
They found seeds from it. They rebrew it.
Right. There's places where they claim they're raising it again. They've discovered ancient in archaeology. Yes, it's a whole interesting topic. Interesting that I'm just quotes it as if it's something that we all know. So anyway, the Alter Rebbe also talks about some of these halachas. Alter Rebbe also talks about some of these halachas, and in the footnote there they mention, we could mention it for different halachas here. We'll bring it up here. What about perfume today? So we said here that the shemen shalafaris when you make a bracha b'rei shemen arev. Let's just say the full sentence here. So the shemen afarsamayim, you make a bracha b'rei shemen arev. So it's a fragrant oil. However, oil itself, you don't make the bracha on. If somehow you put it through a process that the olive oil has a fragrant smell, it has a regular, like a din of something that comes from a tree. And this idea that you take the shemen, right? The Torah says you have a shemen hamishcha, other perfumes that are mixed into the oil. It's a fragrant oil for anointing. So when you have it, have a bunch of ingredients together, so then the varach olav bein mina b'samim, not because it's min chaya, but because there's so many minim mixed together. So that's another reason to say bein mina b'samim. If you lafan of shemen hadas, and if they bring you a shemen and a hadas together, the varach ala hadas separated as a shemen. It's a machlekes in Bisham Basil, but the Rambam says you make the bracha on the hadas, and then that covers the oil. Has the same bracha, they're both from a tree. Now the Alter Rebbe, so they have a footnote there regarding perfume nowadays. We have all kinds of perfumes and stuff. So
by the way, the Sfardim for Havdalah use a cologne or perfume. They don't use solid. It's liquid.
Interesting.
In the shul, I mean, all Sfardim shuls.
Interesting. I think they're also the Armadayak to say the correct bracha. Unlike Ashkenazim, have what we said before.
It's in liquid form.
Mm-hmm. Now, so regarding perfume today, though, just all perfumes that we're familiar with, the Paiskim today say we don't make a bracha on today's perfumes because they're all synthetic and then chemicals, and the chemicals themselves, the original chemical, doesn't have any good smell at all, and through some artificial process, you're creating and extracting some kind of good smell. So that is a din of areach she'en le'ikr. Rambam's going to mention later in Halacha Ches that if you can't point at the actual fragrant substance where the smell originates from, it's a reach she'en le'ikr. There's no origin for the smell, so you don't make a bracha. They say that's the case for perfumes today. For that reason, or for a similar reason, the Bar Hater already talks about you don't make a bracha on smelling tobacco, the tobacco that you smell, shmek tabak. Why? Because the leaves themselves, the dry leaves, tobacco leaves, they don't have a smell. And then they mix it with other ingredients, and those ingredients all together create a good smell, and it's like also a reich she'en le'ikr.
So what do we make in kippur when we smell some? What is it?
What do you make? Which some are you using, or what bracha do you make, or
what some are we using?
You have to be medayik and make sure that if you're actually making brachas from brachas.
It has to be some truly from the.
Yeah, that's directly from a plant, or a min chaya or something like that, like a natural, not something that's overly processed.
When I was a kid in shul, we used to pass around a lemon that was studded with cloves.
Mm-hmm.
So you had the combination of lemon with cloves, and that's what people would smell.
Mm-hmm. Interesting.
But now they pass around ammonia.
We do it with acid also.
Right. Some of those things.
That's why it's a chemical.
Yeah. So if it's a chemical, then probably no bracha. Halacha dalet. Hayu lafan of baisim shu eitz to baisim shu esav. So what if you have two types? One that's from a tree, one that's a grass. In berkas echad man peteres chaveri. One does not cover the other. If you're making the correct brachas, al mavarech al zel atzmai val zel atzmai. If you lafan of yain v'shemen. Now, interestingly, this halacha is come out identical to what we had in the end of Perek Zion. And the Kesef Mishnah says we already had this in Perek Zion, and it's relevant here as well. So the Rambam brings the whole halacha again. If you have yayin and shemen, oiches yayin b'yamina v'shemen b'smayli, you hold the wine in your right hand and the oil in the left hand. L'varech al yayin, she say you make a bracha on the wine and drink it. L'chayz b'varech al shemen and when they make a bracha on the oil and you smell it. But tache b'resh shamash, then you smear it on the head of the waiter. And if he's not allowed to go out perfumed, as we learned in Hilchos Darius, so tache b'kaisa, then you smear it on the wall. Regarding the first point, so the question is that I'm only mentioned baisim shu eitz. What if there's three? What if you have atzi b'samim, isvis b'samim, and mini b'samim? So the Torah says if you just made a beir mini b'samim, then you covered everything. But the Kesef Mishnah says, fine, that's just b'diavad. So according to the Rambam, l'chayra, even then, ideally you should make a separate bracha on each one and not do the b'diavad thing. Halacha hey. What if you're not sure? Like we mentioned earlier, you have sveikas. You don't know. So that's another reason to make a beir mina b'samim. Misafik, it's like a bit like the Alter Rebbe said, it's bad that you're really doing a b'diavad because you don't know. Or perfume that the guy who sells the whatever it is, these types of stuff. He mixed it all together, he made a concoction. So again, it's mixed. So you make a bredi mine. If you walked into the store of a perfumist who has many minin for sale on display, and you can smell it as you walk in all at once. Also, because you're smelling many at once. And now, what's the halacha with the store? If you stayed there all day, you make one bracha. If you went out and in and out, back and forth. Then you can make a bracha each time. However, each time you just make a bredi mina b'samim, and that covers the whole store. After that, and say the Brachos gets into a bit more detail. He says that even if it's perfume, but it's just sitting there in your room, it wasn't on display. You weren't putting it out to smell. You weren't putting it out to sell. You're keeping it in your closet, so that even if you open the closet and you smell it, you should not make a bracha. Even if you went in to smell it, even if that was your intention. Interestingly, like if you just open your perfume, your spice cabinet, and you smell the spices or whatever, it's not. If it's just lying there, not kadei lahariach. However, when it's in a chanos, like the Rambam said, where the whole point is that it's there to be sold and to be enjoyed, so then you have to make a bracha every time you walk in, because the moicher, part of his intention is that you should walk into the store and it should smell good. And people should want to buy it. So the intention was that it should give off a good smell. So that's how the Alter Rebbe describes it and explains it there. Halacha Vav. And now this is really just a discussion about a bunch of species and what bracha is appropriate for each. But in order to understand that, you really have to know what the Rambam is talking about. So first, let's just read the halacha. Hashashana v'chelfei hamayim. Those two mevarchen aleim bredi atze b'samim. So they're eights. Nargis. Now it depends which nargis. If it's shalgina, if it's the garden variety of nargis, bredi atze b'samim. That's an 8. The shalsada, if it's in the field, bredi isrei b'samim. Then it's the grass. Havered umei havered v'alavena v'hamatztikei v'chayetze behen. Now, what are all these things? So first, I'll read the translation from the translated Rambam. He says, Shoshana, Chuf, and Mayim are anemones and lavender, and Nargis, he says, are lilies, and Vered, the Mayverd, is roses and rosewater. That's the easiest. Everyone's in agreement on that. Lavena, frankincense, also everyone's in agreement on that. And Matzdike, he says, are rock roses. Now, if you look in some of the more academic sources that discuss it, so they say Shoshana and Vered aren't the same thing. Usually in common language, Shoshana and Vered are interchangeable. The Kesef Mishnah already points out that it can't be the same thing. He's describing them as different things. So they say Shoshana is the Madonna lily. It's from the lily family, and that's what they say the Shoshana is. The Nargis, they say the word Nargis is, there's a plant called the Narcissus. The Narcissus. It includes the daffodil. The daffodil is the most common form of this plant. You might be familiar with. These are all plants that have been developed for thousands of years. They're well known in antiquity. Interestingly, the word narcissus is very interesting. The word narcissus has a relation to the word narcotics and has a relation to the word narcissism. So the word narcotics comes from Greek. It means numbness. And that's apparently, let's assume that's what this plant has also. Maybe some narcotics were derived from the plant or something like that. There's also the story of Narcissus. So in Greek mythology, you have the guy who was so in love with himself that he stared at his reflection and he couldn't move, and then he turned into this flower. That's the Greek mythologies. And then 100 years ago, the psychologists were looking to come up with some new concepts, and they came up with narcissism based on this story of the guy who stared at himself until he turned into this plant. Just an interesting, that's the narcis. When you see the nargis in the Rambam, it's the narcissus plant. It's related to all these things. Now the word matzdike at the end. So the word matzik, or modern Hebrew, mastic is gum, is chewing gum. In English, you have the word masticating. Masticating means to chew. It's a fancy word for chewing. So the word seems to be related to something from the pistachio family. The Pistachia lentiscus is from the cashew family. The pistachio itself is also from the cashew family. It's not a cashew, but it's related. And the Greek name for it is lentisk mastic, something like that. And it's related to chewing and gnashing the teeth, and it's related to the English. Anyway, so that's a little bit of going off onto what these minim that Rambam is talking about. The Kesef Mishnah actually identified the Chilfei Hamayim in the beginning with nard and with rosemary, which that's what Mefarshim go with. Alter Rebbe goes with. The Alter Rebbe in Seder Brachos says that V'rodim Shishanim. That's regarding roses. No, the Alter Rebbe says that that talks about the spikenard and the rosemary. That's the Chilfei Diyama. Regarding the roses themselves, the Alter Rebbe writes V'rodim Sheim Shishanim Shekayron Raisin. So you make an isvei b'samim if it's from the ground and if it's from a tree, because you could have from a tree as well. Then the atzei b'samim, and even though it's also edible, but that's not the main purpose that roses serve, so you don't make that kind of bracha. Now, to finish off, shleisha minei reach toiv ein mevarchen alein. There are 3 types of good smells you don't make a bracha on. The Elohim, and they are the following, and it's going to go into halacha ches. Reich toiv she'asal riach, but it's a good smell, but it's prohibited to smell. Reich toiv ha'asal ha'av reich ra, a good smell, but its whole purpose is to remove a bad smell. Or a good smell, but the point wasn't actually to smell this very smell. Ketzad, b'sam shal avodah zarah, b'sam shal erva min ha'arayos, ein mevarchen alein. So b'sam avodah zarah or arayos, you don't make a bracha if you also riach, but you're not allowed to smell it, so you can't make a bracha. B'sam shal mesim, b'sam shal beisakise, v'shaman also lahavedas azuma. So some that are used for on a corpse. For a bathroom, like a deodorant, whatever you're spraying, that kind of, anything from that category, or any other shemen that's removing dirt. You don't make a bracha. It's for removing a bad smell. It's not for its own purpose.
Obviously, from the material of the real psum.
Yeah, even if it's from these.
Obviously,
the Havamin, right? You're not using it for the right thing.
It's using the wrong way.
Some kind of detergent maybe that you use for kalim or for clothing. Also, because you don't smell the actual thing. You're just imparting the smell to something else. And if you smell those clothing, you also don't make a bracha because there is not where the perfume is. So now, what's the erva min ha'arayos? So the Rashba has a tshuva about this erva min ha'arayos, and I don't know what the Rambam was talking about. I don't know where the Rambam got this from. Does he mean that it's like a perfume that's put on the part of the erva? Then he quotes the Avudraham. The Kesef quotes the Avudraham who says no. It means that it says you're not allowed to smell someone who's an erva to you. You're not allowed to smell their perfume. So the Rambam is saying in that case you can't make a bracha either because you're not allowed to smell it because it brings to hergel. And that's how he quotes in Shulchan Aruch. B'sam shel erev v'kagoyin kupa shel b'sam on tali b'tzavara, any perfume on a woman. And interestingly, the Magen Avraham says dafka shel erva avol shel pnuya mevarchen. Magen Avraham jumps in to say that if the woman is a pnuya, then you could make a bracha on her perfume. And he's mitzayin to Simon Kufn and Gimel. He says, well, anyway, the Rashba wasn't sure what the Rambam was talking about, so how would the Leisav let's not add to what the Rambam said. The Rambam is already a little tzarechim. What's in Simon Kufn and Gimel? It says over there that you can't take a donation from an Esnam Zaina for a Beis HaKnesses. But it says over there, Le Mikra Zaina Le Isser Erva, Aval Elu HaPnuyas HaKdeshos. If they're pnuyas, then you are allowed to take their donations. That's what it says in Simon Kufn and Gimel. So based on that, the Magen Avraham wanted to say that their perfume is also not usher. Interestingly. And there's more discussions. What if it's not on the woman at the time? Lots of interesting discussions about it. Halacha test. Let's finish off. If you smell besamim at a goyish party, you don't make a bracha. Because we assume there's a avodah zarah involved. If you're walking outside the city and you smell the good smell, you don't know where it's coming from. If the majority are non-Jews, because it's avodah zarah. Majority of Jews, you need to make a bracha. What if they're intermingled? You follow the majority.
And how about if someday you put them to a cooking thing?